Falklands War, how British forces captured Port Stanley just in time. What would drive a country to invade a windswept group of islands thousands of miles away? In April 1982, Argentina launched a surprise military operation to seize the Falkland Islands, known in Argentina as the Malvinas, from British control. While the sovereignty of these remote islands had been disputed for decades, the sudden move was largely driven by Argentina's ruling military junta, eager to deflect attention from a worsening domestic crisis. Many believed the vast distance between the UK and the South Atlantic would make any British military response nearly impossible. But Argentina had miscalculated. Britain responded with unexpected speed and determination, assembling a naval task force and launching what would become one of the last large-scale, conventional military campaigns in its modern history, a war some would later call Britain's final colonial stand. What made these isolated islands worth going to war over, and how did such a distant conflict capture the world's attention? The battle for Stanley, the turning point of the Falklands War. By the end of May 1982, British forces had regained a firm foothold on the Falkland Islands, marking a significant milestone with their initial land victory at Goose Green. However, it was clear that the ultimate and decisive clash would revolve around capturing Port Stanley, the capital. As evening fell on May 29th, a well-equipped Argentine Special Forces patrol moved stealthily along the banks of Moody Brook, a narrow passageway nestled between Mount Longdon and Two Sisters. This patrol had managed to pass undetected through the westernmost outposts of Stanley's defenses, inching closer to the strategically vital Mount Kent, a towering 1,500-foot peak that overlooked the entire Port Stanley area. Unlike the majority of Argentina's military presence, which consisted largely of inexperienced 18-year-old conscripts, this unit was composed of seasoned fighters. Clad in black wool caps, wearing night vision goggles, and their faces smeared with camouflage cream, they were unmistakably elite troops. As they began ascending the rugged lower slopes of Mount Kent, the harsh terrain, filled with cliffs, scree fields, and narrow rock channels, naturally forced them into a single-file path along an old jeep track. It was a logical but perilous decision. Suddenly, the darkness was torn apart by the piercing brilliance of parachute flares, turning the mountainside into a glowing trap. Gunfire erupted, breaking the silence with deadly precision. British forces, prepared and well-positioned, unleashed a barrage that inflicted immediate casualties on the Argentines. Though the initial impact was devastating, these were trained professionals, not untested youth. Regaining their composure quickly, the Argentine troops launched a fierce counterattack that lasted through the night. As dawn approached and their ammunition began to dwindle, the Argentine fighters were forced to withdraw, retreating toward the protective perimeter of Stanley. They left behind 8 of their comrades, 2 dead, the rest either wounded or captured. This encounter marked not only a failed infiltration, but a critical moment that foreshadowed the fall of Stanley and the endgame of the conflict. The silent ascent to victory, the SAS, and the push toward Stanley. Unbeknownst to the Argentine forces on the mist-shrouded night of May 24th and 25th, a shadowy force was already in motion. 2 days before the infamous Battle of Goose Green, elite troopers from D Squadron, 22nd Special Air Service, SAS, were silently inserted by helicopter onto the western slopes of Mount Kent. This strategic position, previously only occupied by a vulnerable Argentine helicopter squadron, had been devastated by repeated Harrier attacks launched from the carriers Invincible and Hermes. The remnants of the Argentine presence, burned-out helicopters and hastily abandoned equipment, stood as grim testaments to their retreat toward Stanley. In the days that followed, additional SAS units stealthily ascended Mount Kent, establishing an unparalleled vantage point. From the summit, Colonel Michael Rose, the SAS commander, observed not only the outermost Argentine defenses, but also, astonishingly, the very streets of Stanley, just 50 miles to the east. With the battlefield unfolding below him, Rose began to orchestrate a masterclass in reconnaissance and forward positioning. Simultaneously, the British ground forces prepared for their grueling march eastward. Long columns of the Parachute Regiment and 45 Commando Royal Marines began moving across the unforgiving terrain, stone runs and treacherous peat bogs stretching between them and the capital. For the Paras, it was tabbing. For the Marines, yomping. Whatever the term, the exertion was the same. Burdensome packs, heavy weaponry, and extra ammunition made the journey a physical crucible. Originally, Brigadier Julian Thompson had planned to deploy his men by helicopter, sparing them the punishing march. But fate intervened on May 26th, when an Argentine Exocet missile struck the Atlantic conveyor, sinking with it nearly all of the task force's heavy-lift helicopters. Only one Chinook survived the attack, and with that, Thompson's logistical hopes sank as well. Though he expressed strong reservations about advancing on foot, especially after a demoralizing sea voyage, London would hear none of it. At Northwood headquarters, under mounting political pressure from Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, orders were clear: proceed immediately or be replaced. The War Cabinet's greatest fear was that U.S. envoy Al Haig's peace negotiations might yield a politically acceptable, yet militarily disastrous compromise, one which allowed Argentina to maintain a foothold on the Falklands. For Thatcher, such an outcome would be indistinguishable from surrender, a concession to aggression. Under the weight of political urgency, diplomatic uncertainty, and a rapidly closing window of opportunity, Northwood passed the pressure down the chain. It was now on Brigadier Thompson and his exhausted but determined men to carry the mission forward through mud, stone, and bitter cold toward Stanley and victory. 3. Marching into misery, the silent toll of remote warfare. In the shadowy corridors of strategy and statesmanship, decisions are made far from the battlefield, often at a distance so vast that the emotional and physical weight of those choices never touches the hands that make them. Running a war from 8,000 miles away becomes less a matter of command and more a gamble of trust, terrain, and time. In such remote campaigns, true control slips from polished conference tables into the muddied boots of ground commanders. These men, attuned to the harsh rhythm of the land and the mood of their troops, bear the crushing responsibility of translating political urgency into tactical reality. The burden of command extended to figures like Norwood, whose task was to channel the high-level political imperatives from the War Cabinet to the weary boots on the ground. The orders may have been clear: advance rapidly, engage decisively, but reality rarely conforms to the clean lines of maps and schedules. The terrain was unforgiving, a cruel mosaic of peat bogs and jagged stone ridges. Each step forward was a slow, sodden battle. Soldiers, burdened by loads reaching 100 pounds, sank into the springy, soaking earth, their boots filled with freezing water within minutes of marching. The weather, too, seemed a co-conspirator in the campaign's cruelty. One moment, brilliant sunshine bathed the men in deceptive warmth. The next, stinging sleet lashed at their faces, driven by relentless 15-knot winds. By nightfall, the cold became merciless, dragging the temperature below freezing. Sleep was stolen by the icy bite of wind and rain that transformed into sharp sleet, numbing both skin and spirit. With no air support, no drying stations, and often no guaranteed supply line, the men pushed forward into the unknown with no promise of comfort on the horizon. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that haunted them. Drinking from the brown, stagnant bogs led to outbreaks of diarrhea. Feet, constantly soaked, became breeding grounds for trenchfoot, a ghastly echo of World War I. Hypothermia whispered through the ranks like a ghost, sapping strength from already spent bodies. The countryside, silent and uncaring, bore witness to men who were not just fighting an enemy, but fighting their own slow unraveling. And still, they marched, driven not by orders alone, but by the intangible weight of duty, by the knowledge that far away, in clean rooms filled with charts and briefings, people waited for outcomes. The politics of war may have been scripted in distant halls, but its cost was etched into every shivering step, every blistered heel, every silent scream swallowed by the wind. 4. Whispers in the Wind, a daring gamble on the slopes of Mount Kent. As the final days of May 1982 whispered across the rugged, windswept terrain of the Falkland Islands, something stirred beneath the shadowed ridges of Mount Kent. The war between Britain and Argentina had already revealed its teeth in blood and fire, yet in this frozen silence, a daring act was about to unfold, one that would etch itself into the legacy of unconventional warfare. Dawn had barely begun to dilute the deep blues of the Falkland sky when the low thrum of rotor blades began to resonate across the northern slopes. 2 Argentine UH-1H Iroquois helicopters, known to their crews simply as Hueys, emerged like phantoms, hugging the ground with surgical precision. Their mission was bold, almost reckless. Gliding dangerously low over British-held territory, the aircraft skimmed just above the frost-hardened grass, bypassing 3 parachute regiment positions unnoticed. Their target, a solitary house nestled in a shallow valley, about 5 miles west of the critical axis toward Port Stanley. The building was known as Top Malo House. To the Argentine command, this dilapidated structure offered more than just shelter. Its elevated surroundings gave an unobstructed view of the approaches to Stanley, and with British forces massing for a final push, holding this outpost could provide precious intelligence and strategic advantage. Within hours, a contingent of elite Argentine troops from the 602 Commando Company had established themselves inside and around the house, preparing to relay what they saw back to their command in Stanley. But this silent occupation had not gone unnoticed. Miles away, the sharp-eyed observers of a British reconnaissance post, trained to spot even the faintest disruption in the terrain, had witnessed the Hueys' arrival. Plans were rapidly set into motion. At first light on the morning of May 31st, the still air was pierced by the roar of a Sea King helicopter. Aboard was Captain Rodney Boswell of the Royal Marines, leading an 18-man unit from the Arctic and mountain warfare cadre, a group forged in the harshest environments and trained for exactly this kind of mountain strike. Boswell would later recall that the flight in was the fastest and lowest he had ever experienced. The helicopter dropped them in a shallow depression 2 miles from Top Malo House, concealed from view and perfectly positioned for a surprise assault. What followed was a brief, but ferocious engagement, one that would become a case study in small unit tactics, surprise, and close quarters combat. A steady advance, the British strategy in the Falklands conflict. During the Falklands War, the British forces didn't rely on one massive assault to win. Instead, they followed a steady, step-by-step approach to reclaim the islands from Argentine control. This method, often called bite and hold, involved moving forward slowly but surely, capturing important terrain such as ridgelines or hills, and then securing those gains. It wasn't about flashy victories. It was about smart, calculated progress. For example, in one clash, the British Royal Marines suffered 3 wounded soldiers. On the other hand, the Argentinians lost 5 soldiers and had 12 captured, 7 of whom were injured. These numbers show how every skirmish came at a cost, but also slowly tilted the advantage toward the British. The idea behind the bite and hold strategy was simple but powerful. First, the troops would advance to a strategically important location. Then, they would dig in, bringing in supplies, reinforcing their position with more soldiers, and preparing for any counterattacks. This kind of preparation allowed them to hold what they had gained without needing to rush into riskier situations. This method wasn't just effective in terms of physical ground. It also had a major impact on morale. Each time the British forces captured a key position, it shook the confidence of the Argentine troops. They lost not just land, but also important capabilities like forward observers and patrol units that helped them gather intelligence. Without these, their ability to respond to British moves weakened day by day. One notable success of this approach was seen at places like Mount Kent and Mount Longdon, where British troops managed to gain and hold high ground. These victories weren't massive in size, but they were crucial in building momentum. Importantly, this ongoing pressure kept British troops engaged and motivated. They saw the results of their hard work and could sense they were inching closer to their main objective, Port Stanley. Instead of risking everything on one big battle that might have ended in failure, they opted for smaller, more manageable victories that added up over time. In the end, this thoughtful, deliberate strategy played a key role in the British success in the Falklands. 6. The race to Stanley, mounting pressure and the final push. As British forces continued to build momentum in the South Atlantic, a significant reinforcement effort took place on May 30th. The 5th Infantry Brigade, having departed from Southampton aboard the QE-2 on May 12th, arrived in the region and anchored off Grytviken, South Georgia. From there, troops were transferred to the Canberra for the final 700-mile journey to the Falkland Islands. On June the 1st, the brigade began its disembarkation at San Carlos, where Major General Jeremy Moore, the overall task force commander, established his central command post. Concurrently, Brigadier Julian Thompson, returning to his original command of the 3rd Brigade, relocated his headquarters to Teal Inlet. At this critical juncture, political urgency back home was mounting rapidly. Pressure from the British government, particularly from Defense Secretary John Knott, pushed Moore to act swiftly and capture Port Stanley before international dynamics shifted further out of the UK's favor. On May 31st, U.S. President Ronald Reagan placed a call to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, expressing concern over the increasingly negative sentiment spreading across Latin America, a worrying signal that American diplomatic backing might soon waver. This conversation highlighted the geopolitical fragility of the operation and added to the growing strain on British decision-makers. Compounding the political pressure was a looming logistical deadline. Admiral Sandy Woodward, commanding the Royal Navy fleet in the region, warned that naval support could not be maintained indefinitely. The surface fleet, vulnerable to both enemy action and the harsh South Atlantic winter, was nearing the limit of its operational endurance. Woodward made it clear that the fleet would likely need to withdraw by mid-June, making any delay in ground operations a costly risk. With time running short and strategic patience wearing thin, it became evident that the British campaign had entered a critical phase. Every movement, every decision was now shadowed by the need for urgency. The landing of 5 Brigade significantly bolstered British ground strength, but the complexity of coordinating operations over difficult terrain with limited air cover and under constant threat from Argentine forces made the path to Stanley anything but straightforward. Yet, with high-level backing beginning to waver and naval support constrained by time, there was no option but to push forward. The campaign had become a race, not just against the enemy, but against international opinion, internal political pressure, and the unforgiving constraints of time and distance. The drive to Port Stanley had to proceed with decisive speed, lest the opportunity for a clear British victory slip away. F. The tragedy at Bluff Cove, a turning point in the Falklands conflict. Between May 31st and June 8th, the British forces initiated a strategic maneuver to encircle Stanley, deploying units from 3 and 5 brigades. During this phase, 42 Commando Royal Marines were airlifted to Mount Kent, while 2nd Battalion, Parachute Regiment, 2 Para, was transported by helicopter to Bluff Cove. Simultaneously, 2nd Battalion Scots Guards and the Welsh Guards made their way to Bluff Cove and Fitzroy aboard Landing Ship Logistics, LSLs. However, a combination of flawed decisions and unfortunate timing led to a tragic sequence of events. On June 8th, 2 companies of the Welsh Guards remained aboard the RFA Sir Galahad, anchored at Fitzroy for over 5 hours, dangerously exposed and within view of Argentine forces stationed at Mount Harriet, only 10 miles away. In the early afternoon, the silence was shattered as 5 Argentine A-4 Skyhawks launched a low-level airstrike on the British landing zone. The attack began with Sir Tristram, which suffered 2 bomb hits. One failed to detonate, but the other exploded on the vehicle deck. However, the brunt of the assault targeted Sir Galahad. 3 bombs ripped into the ship, unleashing fireballs as their explosive contents ignited. Flames engulfed the interior, turning the vessel into an inferno. This attack would become the deadliest British loss of life in the entire Falklands War. A total of 46 servicemen perished aboard Sir Galahad, and more than 150 were wounded, many sustaining severe burns. The scale of the disaster overwhelmed the improvised medical facility at Ajax Bay. According to Surgeon Commander Rick Jolly's diary entry from that harrowing day, the situation rapidly spiraled into chaos. As dusk fell, helicopters delivered a continuous stream of casualties, the triage and resuscitation zones overflowing. With over 120 victims arriving, most of them burn casualties, the medical team worked relentlessly, yet the full extent of the suffering was only beginning to unfold. 8. Bluff Cove, a hard lesson in the limits of improvisation and conscription. The disaster at Bluff Cove during the Falklands War offers a sobering insight into the dangers of deploying an inadequately prepared and hastily assembled force into complex combat operations. In this case, 5 Brigade, a loosely structured and improvised unit, was thrust into an unforgiving operational environment with tragic results. Comprised of the Scots Guards, Welsh Guards, and Gurkhas, this formation lacked the cohesion, training, and acclimatization that characterized the better-prepared Parachute Regiment and Royal Marines. Many of the troops, particularly the Welsh Guards, had only recently transitioned from ceremonial duties in London. They were wholly unprepared for the harsh terrain and high-intensity warfare of the Falklands. Marching across the island was beyond their physical capacity, necessitating sea transport. But without established air superiority, these movements were dangerously exposed to Argentine air attacks, culminating in the Bluff Cove disaster. Ships transporting troops were struck in a devastating air raid, resulting in significant British casualties and loss of equipment. In the aftermath, some British analysts argued the tragedy had a silver lining. It allegedly distracted Argentine forces, focusing their attention on the southwestern approaches to Port Stanley. Yet, hard evidence for this theory remains scant. By June 10th, Argentine forces had already adopted a comprehensive defensive posture. Menendez, the Argentine commander, had strategically stationed the 25th, 6th, and 3rd Regiments to repel any direct amphibious assault, while the 7th Regiment entrenched itself on Mount Longdon, supported by a hardened platoon from the Argentine 5th Marines, armed with 50-caliber heavy machine guns. Meanwhile, the rest of the 5th Marines occupied Mount Tumbledown, and the 4th Regiment held Mount Harriet and Two Sisters. Even as their air force diminished under the relentless pressure of British Harriers, the Argentines maintained a potent artillery presence. Menendez commanded 42 105 mm and 350 mm artillery pieces, cleverly placed within civilian areas around Port Stanley to discourage British counter-battery fire. British criticism of Argentine strategy often centers on their defensive rigidity, questioning why they didn't take the initiative, attack the San Carlos beachhead, or reinforce key positions like Darwin and Goose Green. However, such assessments often overlook a critical reality. The Argentine army was largely made up of under-trained 18 and 19-year-old conscripts. Expecting these young soldiers to perform at the level of professional European troops was unrealistic. Menendez understood their limitations. Like Generals Slim and Montgomery in previous wars, he chose a defensive strategy, not out of passivity, but as the most rational option given the tools at his disposal. Despite chronic supply issues and poor leadership from administrative echelons, the hardships of trench life ultimately fostered greater cohesion among Argentine conscripts. Though miserably dug in and constantly under pressure, many units were surprisingly resilient, armed, determined, and bonded by shared adversity. The Argentine position was far from weak, and the British advance was met with tenacious, if youthful, resistance. Bluff Cove, then, was not just a tragedy, but a turning point that exposed the brutal consequences of improvisation and the sobering complexity of warfare with conscript armies. 9. Into the shadows of Longdon, a night of steel and silence. As dusk fell over the bleak and windswept terrain of East Falkland on June 10, 1982, the landscape held its breath. The British forces were poised for a synchronized assault, a meticulously planned yet perilous operation that would unfold across the darkened hills in a sweeping arc of steel and silence. The plan was to strike from north to south in the fading light, a calculated dance of precision and courage. At exactly 2,000 hours, Zulu, 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, 3 Para, would begin the attack on Mount Longdon. Half an hour later, at 20:30, 45 Commando Royal Marines, were to move against two sisters, and by 2100, 42 Commando would engage Mount Harriet. Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Pike, commanding 3 Para, had spent days analyzing Mount Longdon, his intended prize. From the vantage points west of the Murrell River, the mountain revealed itself as a jagged sentinel of rock and shadow, rising some 500 feet above the surrounding wilderness. But it was not just the height that threatened, it was the ancient fury of the land itself. Glacial grinding, wind-scoured cliffs, and centuries of water erosion had turned the western slopes into a maze of natural fortresses, crevices, gullies, re-entrants, and hidden hollows, a stone labyrinth that seemed carved for war. The mountain was not empty. Over 300 Argentine soldiers, including hardened fighters from the 5th Marine Battalion, had transformed Longdon into a bastion. Dug into the rock, they lay in wait, deep in caves, camouflaged in trenches, their machine guns and mortars covering every possible approach. Intelligence confirmed that to the south lay Mount Tumbledown, bristling with more Argentine defenders, making a southern flanking maneuver suicidal. So Pike made his decision. The assault would come from the north and west, where the terrain was cruel but not suicidal. The northern face of Longdon was a wall of rock, rising in sheer cliffs as high as 100 feet in places, yet Pike believed this very difficulty could conceal his men. They would move under cover of night, silently, without the aid of artillery until they were discovered. The goal was to reach the lower slopes before the Argentines were even aware they were there. From his forward observation post, Pike watched the mountain, knowing it was more than just a tactical target. It was a fortress crafted by time and sharpened by history. What he could not fully see, what none of them could, was just how grim the fight would become. In the darkness, surrounded by cold stone and the ever-present threat of ambush, British paratroopers would descend into a brutal hand-to-hand struggle, lit only by gunfire and the flares of war. Mount Longdon was not merely an objective. It was a crucible, a test of nerve, of endurance, of leadership. And as the first men moved forward into the silence, no one could know how high the cost of victory would be. 10. Whispers before the storm, the approach to Mount Longdon. The night air pulsed with anticipation. It was not the kind of quiet that calms the soul, but a silence pregnant with tension, like the stillness that descends just before lightning rips the sky. In that deep, shrouded darkness, the men of Para's A and B companies began their silent ascent, every footstep a prayer to the gods of war and chance. There was no grand speech, no rallying cry, only the knowledge that the fate of their mission, and possibly their lives, rested on the razor's edge of surprise. Nature itself conspired in their favor, at least at first. A thick mantle of clouds drifted across the heavens, veiling the moon and cloaking the landscape in spectral black. A high wind surged through the mountain passes, whispering over the rocks and howling between crevices, masking the crunch of boots and the occasional rattle of kit. The men, silhouettes swallowed by shadow, advanced like ghosts, threading through the bleak terrain toward Mount Longdon. They were trained for moments like this, conditioned to move through fear, to silence breath and heartbeat alike. Yet even the most disciplined nerves quivered when, mere hundreds of yards from the base, the clouds parted without warning. A pale, sickly moonlight spilled across the slopes, bathing the moraine in a silver glow. In that instant, it was as if a celestial spotlight had pinned them in place. Still, they moved forward. Another 400 yards brought them within breathing distance of the enemy. Hearts pounded in every chest, each beat a drum roll toward destiny. Had the Argentines seen them? Would the cry go up? But silence held. The illusion of invisibility, however thin, remained unbroken. Then came the cruel punctuation of fate. Corporal Brian Milne, leading a section of 4 platoon, stepped on a mine. The explosion shattered the quiet, shredded the calm, and tore his foot from his body. In that violent burst, stealth gave way to fire. The paras opened up on the enemy camp, riddling pup tents with gunfire, and chaos exploded across the mountain. It was the beginning of one of the bloodiest and most grueling engagements of the Falklands campaign. But in those final moments before the mine, there was a strange, beautiful clarity. The calm before combat. The illusion that perhaps, just perhaps, the gods of war would let them pass unseen. They wouldn't. 11. The night assault on Two Sisters Ridge. In the dark hours following the battle for Mount Longdon during the Falklands War, British forces pressed on toward their next objective, Two Sisters Ridge. This high ground, made up of 2 rocky peaks, one to the west and one to the east, was held by around 300 well-armed Argentine soldiers. They were dug into defensive positions with mortars and heavy machine guns, ready to fight hard to hold the ridge. To the south of the ridge, Royal Marines from 45 Commando were preparing to attack. 3 companies, X, Y, and Z, had crossed the Merle River roughly half an hour after 3 Para, a battalion of British paratroopers, had begun its own assault on Mount Longdon. The commander of 45 Commando, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Whitehead, had a plan. X Company would launch a direct assault on the western peak. Their job was to draw the enemy's attention and fire. Meanwhile, Y and Z companies would move around from the north and strike the Argentines on their right flank, hitting them from a less defended angle. However, things didn't go as smoothly as planned. X Company struggled to move into position. Their commander had estimated it would take 3 hours to get ready, but it ended up taking 6. By the time they began climbing the western slopes of Two Sisters, the Argentines were ready and opened fire with heavy machine guns. There was no support from artillery, and their mortar fire wasn't making much impact. In a bold move, the Marines began firing anti-tank missiles directly at the enemy bunkers as they picked their way through rough, rocky terrain, getting closer to their targets. While this was happening, Y and Z companies had reached the northern slopes of the ridge, but were also under intense fire. Argentine 50 caliber machine guns kept them pinned down, and mortar bombs began landing dangerously close behind them. Realizing they were being targeted and could not wait any longer, the Marines of Z Company stood up and charged up the slope, yelling their fierce battle cry, "Zulu! Zulu!" Y Company quickly followed, and the fight turned brutal and close. British troops fought their way into Argentine positions with bayonets, and the defenders, shaken by the ferocity of the assault, began to break. Around 250 Argentine soldiers fled east toward Mount Tumbledown, leaving behind 10 dead and 54 wounded. 12. The battle for Mount Harriet, a tactical masterstroke. Approximately 1.5 miles south of Two Sisters stood Mount Harriet, a key strategic position from which Argentine forces could oversee and control the southwestern routes leading into Port Stanley. Recognizing the importance of this high ground, Lieutenant Colonel Nick Vaugh, commanding officer of 42 Commando Royal Marines, orchestrated a complex and daring plan to seize it. Rather than opting for a direct frontal assault, Vaux devised a two-pronged strategy that relied heavily on misdirection and stealth. To begin with, J Company was assigned the task of launching a diversionary attack due west. This maneuver, though not intended to achieve a breakthrough, served a critical purpose: to draw Argentine focus and resources toward what they assumed was the main axis of the British advance. Simultaneously, K and L companies were dispatched on a perilous flanking march through treacherous, mine-laden terrain to the southeast, a route considered unlikely by Argentine commanders and thus less defended. What made the operation even more effective was the chaos unfolding nearby at Mount Longdon, where fierce fighting was already consuming Argentine attention. Many of their troops remained fixated on that battle, inadvertently lowering their guard along Mount Harriet. Under cover of darkness, and with a growing sense of confusion in enemy ranks, the Royal Marines advanced steadily. The element of surprise proved decisive. The commandos closed in with swift aggression, using the natural cover of the rocky terrain to their advantage. When the British forces finally surged through the rocks and into the Argentine positions, the defenders, caught off guard and already demoralized, fell into disarray. While there was some resistance, it lacked coordination and resolve. Instead of retreating eastward towards the comparative safety of Port Stanley, many Argentine soldiers fled westward, inadvertently cornering themselves in a narrow canyon at the western end of Mount Harriet. It was there that the final trap was sprung. With support from Mount Challenger and coordinated fire from a British fire base, the canyon became a deadly funnel. The encircled Argentine troops found themselves trapped under heavy fire and without viable escape. The outcome was swift and decisive. British forces captured approximately 250 prisoners and discovered an additional 10 Argentine soldiers dead among the rocks. In contrast, 42 commandos sustained minimal losses, just 11 casualties in total, with only one fatal. The assault on Mount Harriet remains a textbook example of military ingenuity, where deception, terrain exploitation, and psychological warfare combined to deliver a decisive blow with minimal cost. The final push toward Stanley, a coordinated effort. Initially, Major General Jeremy Moore had planned to launch the second phase of the offensive, specifically the assaults on Tumbledown and Wireless Ridge, on the night of June 12th to 13th. However, this plan was postponed by 24 hours at the request of Brigadier Tony Wilson, commander of 5 Brigade, who sought additional time for his officers to thoroughly assess and reconfirm their objectives. Moore, facing significant logistical challenges following the intense battles of June 11th and 12th, welcomed the delay, recognizing that the fire support and supply issues resulting from those earlier engagements needed to be resolved before advancing further. By the evening of June 14th, 3 battalions were redeployed to resume the attack. At this critical juncture, Moore and Brigadier Julian Thompson had to coordinate how best to utilize their 2 brigades, 3 Commando Brigade and 5 Infantry Brigade. A significant challenge lay in the composition and preparedness of 5 Brigade. Unlike 3 Commando, which had trained and fought cohesively as a unit, 5 Brigade had not previously operated together in combat. Furthermore, key battalions such as the Scots Guards and the Welsh Guards had until recently been engaged in ceremonial duties, leaving them underprepared for high-intensity warfare in such harsh terrain. Despite these limitations, strategic and political considerations played a crucial role in the deployment decisions. It was important, not only from a morale standpoint, but also from a military-political perspective that each unit had the opportunity to face the enemy. Beyond this symbolic value, practical realities also justified the decision. While 3 Commando and the Parachute Regiment had been physically depleted by their grueling march and engagements across East Falkland, the Guards units of 5 Brigade remained relatively fresh and ready to fight. Ultimately, the final battles around Stanley were conducted as a joint effort between the 2 brigades. This approach reflected the broader pattern of cooperation and adaptability that had characterized the British campaign since their landing at San Carlos and later movements through Fitzroy. 14. The Battle for Tumbledown, a night of grit and glory. The final push toward Port Stanley during the Falklands War hinged on a critical confrontation, one that would test both resolve and professionalism in the harshest of conditions. The assault on Tumbledown Mountain, a formidable ridge west of Stanley, marked a turning point in the campaign and showcased the fierce determination of the British forces, especially the 2nd Battalion of the Scots Guards. 5 Infantry Brigade was assigned the main effort. The plan involved a coordinated attack. The Scots Guards were to lead the assault on Tumbledown, while the 1st and 7th Gurkhas would push through toward Mount William, a strategic spur southeast of Tumbledown. At the same time, 2 Para, previously held in reserve, was ordered to take Wireless Ridge. Although the original plan was to launch the attack the following night, delays in preparation forced a 24-hour postponement. This pause, though not ideal in terms of momentum, allowed the brigade to gather essential resources for the decisive blow toward Stanley. Tumbledown Mountain was no easy target. It stretched for nearly 3 miles and featured a rugged ridge with sheer cliffs on its northern edge, rendering any frontal assault from that direction nearly impossible. The southwestern approach offered more hope, and it was here that the Scots Guards planned their advance. However, Argentine forces had fortified their positions well. The 5th Marine Infantry Battalion, considered the elite of the Argentine defenders, was entrenched there, supported by heavy artillery located just 5 miles away. G Company of the Scots Guards moved quietly along the western flank, initially undetected. They secured part of the ridge before Major John Kisley's company advanced further. For a short while, they moved forward unopposed, but soon encountered intense enemy fire. Pinned down and unable to call in effective artillery support due to the absence of a forward observation officer, Kisley faced a critical challenge. In the pitch-black night, battered by icy winds, he took the initiative. After waiting 3 hours and realizing fire support would not materialize as hoped, he directed his platoons to gather rocket launchers and machine guns and press the attack manually. Kisley personally led 14 and 15 platoons across the false crests of Tumbledown, each rise revealing yet another obstacle. Over a grueling 800-yard advance, they overran enemy positions and captured prisoners, requiring constant detachments to escort them to the rear. Eventually, Kisley and a handful of men reached the summit, a rocky outcrop offering a view of Stanley's flickering streetlights below. The Scots Guards had taken Tumbledown after 11 hours of brutal combat. They suffered 7 fatalities and over 40 wounded. The Argentine 5th Marines, having fought tenaciously, lost around 30 men, with 14 captured. This battle was a clash of professionals, veterans on both sides engaged in one of warfare's most complex maneuvers, a night assault against a well-defended position. In the end, it was discipline, training, and the will to advance under fire that carried the day and opened the final path to victory in the Falklands. 15. The Fall of Wireless Ridge. a hypnotic march toward victory. In the twilight hours of the Falklands conflict, as the cold winds whispered across the windswept hills north of Port Stanley, a relentless force moved through the shadows. The men of 2nd Battalion, Parachute Regiment, 2 Para, under the composed command of Lieutenant Colonel David Chandler, advanced upon their target with clinical determination. Their destination: Wireless Ridge, a natural defensive spine stretching east to west, positioned roughly a mile north of the formidable Mount Tumbledown. The Argentine defenders entrenched there, remnants of the embattled 7th Infantry Regiment, had already endured the trauma of the Battle of Mount Longdon. Worn and wary, they now faced the full might of a rejuvenated British force. Around 500 Argentine soldiers had dug themselves into the cold earth, but they would find little comfort in their positions. In a diversionary ballet of precision and courage, Royal Marine raiding parties launched from rigid raiders, their dark silhouettes slicing across the inlet of Hen Water. DG squadrons of the elite SAS surged forward in the gloom, facing ferocious fire from both the fortified eastern ridges and a nest of anti-aircraft guns bristling north of Stanley. Miraculously, they turned back with only 3 casualties, a testament to their agility and nerve. As the main assault began, it was met with an orchestra of firepower unprecedented in the conflict. British field artillery unleashed a ferocious bombardment. Over 6,105mm shells rained upon the ridge, shaking the very ground beneath the defenders. Naval support joined in, with 2 frigates launching a relentless barrage of 4.5-inch shells into Argentine positions. Armored support came in the form of 2 Scorpion and 2 Scimitar light tanks, their cannons churning out streams of 76mm and 30mm shells, complemented by a hailstorm of 7 62mm machine gun fire. Mortar platoons of 3 Para worked in perfect unison with 2 Para, creating a near-ceaseless arc of explosive descent upon the ridge. A machine gun platoon poured out over 40,000 rounds, nearly rendering their weapons useless in the heat of sustained fire. Under this overwhelming assault, Argentine resistance crumbled. D Company met brief resistance at the ridge's peak, but the enemy's will had been shattered. When silence fell, 14 British paratroopers had paid the ultimate price, 3 of them killed. Yet their sacrifice broke the enemy line. Nearly 100 Argentine soldiers lay dead, 37 wounded were taken prisoner, and the rest fled toward Stanley under the watchful gaze of a triumphant, unstoppable advance. Wireless Ridge had fallen, and with it, the final defense before the end. 16. The Fall of Resistance. Shadows over Stanley. In the pale light before dawn, something shifted in the rhythm of war, not with the suddenness of an explosion, but like a slow, irreversible tide swallowing the last embers of defiance. High above the bleak ridgelines of East Falkland, British forces moved with relentless precision, their progress accelerated not by brute force alone, but by the disintegration of Argentine resolve. The soldiers of 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, 2 Para, advanced through the twisted remains of Wireless Ridge, driving the last of the fleeing Argentine defenders toward the town of Stanley. A sense of collapse hung heavy in the air, not only tactical but psychological. British Special Air Service SAS units, surgically positioned near Stanley Harbor, directed artillery with quiet efficiency, hastening the retreat and amplifying the sense of inevitability. The once firm Argentine lines melted away, revealing a military structure on the verge of breakdown. On Mount William, British units discovered not resistance, but absence. The Argentine garrison had already abandoned their posts under cover of darkness. Then came the final maneuver, a daring airlift of 45 Commando Royal Marines to Sapper Hill, the last defensible high ground before Stanley itself. There was no battle, no final stand, only silence. The British occupied the position without a shot fired, as though the island itself had exhaled in surrender. Far from the front lines, in a makeshift command post within the shrinking Argentine perimeter, General Mario Menendez felt the weight of defeat settle upon him like a fog. For much of the night, he had clung to illusions of tactical success, reports of supposed British armor attacks from the southwest, whispers of an amphibious assault from the northeast. But as daylight broke, reality cast its stark light upon the situation. Despite superior numbers and firepower on paper, the Argentine defense had unraveled. The general's isolation became suffocating. Conversations with President Galtieri in Buenos Aires offered no comfort, only stern reminders that surrender was dishonorable unless resistance was physically impossible. But Menendez, emotionally frayed and surrounded by exhausted soldiers who had given everything, could no longer believe in distant orders. He was no longer defending a position. He was watching over the last breath of a defeated army. By late morning on June 14, 1982, with no artillery, no support, and no viable escape, Menendez made a quiet, fateful choice. After a final plea over the radio to Galtieri, heard even by eavesdropping British forces, he turned instead to a Spanish-speaking British officer and agreed to parley. That evening, at 21:15, the war was over. The surrender was signed not with fanfare, but with weary acceptance. In the long shadows cast over Stanley, resistance faded into history. In the British campaign in the Falklands, logistics were paramount. The 8,000-mile distance from Britain to the South Atlantic required meticulous logistical planning. Not only did it require the transportation of supplies, equipment, and supplies from Britain to the Falklands, but also the transportation of them from the landing beaches to the strategic locations where they were needed on the islands. However, there is no evidence that Britain was in a logistical crisis by mid-June. The greatest threat at the time was the ability to maintain its warships. Admiral Sandy Woodward clearly noted the critical state of the Navy at the time. Ships were being battered by the harsh conditions of the South Atlantic winter, a brutal combination of ice and salt water. These factors severely degraded the effectiveness of early warning and communication systems. He understood that the time was approaching when he would have to retreat to Ascension Island to preserve his forces, since it was impossible to maintain his ships in such conditions. Estimates suggested that the fleet could only maintain its position for another 5 or 6 days at most. The final victory, therefore, could be said to be an 11th-hour success, not only thanks to well-organized logistics, but also to the persistent, resilient support of the naval force under extremely harsh conditions. If you find this analysis useful, don't forget to like and follow to continue updating other interesting historical content.